Hello and welcome. This video was created to help people relax or sleep with this in mind. I only put 3 ads in the entire video. The stories in this video are allegedly true and actually happened. If you enjoy this video, please subscribe to my channel and like the video. Lastly, thank you for being here. When you have so many other choices. Now, let's begin. It was a bright Saturday morning when I woke up. The sun shining through the window, casting a soft glow across the room. There was a stillness in the air, a calmness that seemed to stretch out over everything. I stretched my arms and let out a long yawn, savoring the moment of quiet before the world outside came rushing in. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. Another reminder, a text from my friend Sam, confirming the camping trip we'd been planning for weeks. "Don't forget to pack the snacks, see you in a couple of hours," the message read. It had been months since I'd had a weekend off, and this trip felt like the perfect escape from the routine of work and city life. The forest had always been a place of peace for me, a retreat into nature where the noise of the world could fade into the background. Sam and I had been on many camping trips together, but this one felt different. I couldn't quite place it, but there was an odd excitement in the air, something almost electric. It was the kind of feeling that crept up on you, barely noticeable, but there nonetheless. I got out of bed, moving through the motions of my morning routine. A cup of coffee, a quick shower, and then the task of packing. The weather forecast predicted perfect conditions for camping. Clear skies, mild temperatures, the kind of weather that made you want to breathe in the fresh air and get lost in the woods. I opened my closet and began to gather my gear: tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, extra batteries, and a few other essentials. As I zipped up my bag, a sudden chill swept through the room. I paused for a moment, the feeling of coldness standing out in the otherwise warm space. The breeze from the open windows stirred the curtains slightly, but it didn't seem to make sense. There wasn't a draft strong enough to explain the drop in temperature. "Damn," I whispered to myself. "I keep saying the same thing about the cold." Shaking it off, I finished packing and headed to the kitchen to grab a quick bite before leaving. My phone buzzed again. Sam was already on his way. A few minutes later, the sound of an engine pulling into the driveway confirmed he was here. We loaded the car with all the camping supplies and headed out toward the forest. The drive was peaceful, the road winding through countryside, the trees growing thicker as we neared our destination. We joked about the usual things: work, the weather, and the last time we'd gotten lost in the woods. The conversation flowed easily, just like it always did when we were together. When we finally reached the campsite, it felt as though we had stepped into a different world. The towering trees loomed overhead, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The smell of pine filled the air, and the sounds of the forest chirping birds, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, created a natural symphony. The forest was quiet, but not silent, and I felt the weight of it settle over me as I took in the beauty of the surroundings. "Perfect spot," Sam said, unloading the gear from the car. I nodded in agreement, setting up the tent near the edge of a clearing, just a short walk from the small stream that ran through the area. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. As I worked to set up the tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything specific, just a vague sense that I wasn't entirely alone. The wind seemed to whisper through the trees, carrying with it a faint rustling sound, like someone was walking just beyond the edge of my vision. I told myself it was nothing, just the usual sounds of the forest. But still, a small knot formed in my stomach. Once the camp was set up, Sam and I built a fire. The crackling flames offered warmth against the cool evening air, and the glow from the fire flickered across our faces as we sat down on logs around it. We talked, laughed, and enjoyed the peaceful solitude, the worries of the outside world slipping further away with each passing hour. The night fell quickly, and with it the forest seemed to change. The once lively sounds of birds and insects began to fade, replaced by a heavy silence. The only noise now was the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of the trees, as if they were whispering secrets to one another. I glanced around, my eyes scanning the dark woods beyond the camp. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper, more menacing, as though something was lurking just out of sight. I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts away. It was just the darkness playing tricks on my mind. The firelight cast long shadows that danced and shifted, creating shapes that seemed to move on their own. "Everything okay?" Sam asked, noticing the way I was staring into the trees. "Yeah, just feels like someone's watching us," I said, forcing a smile. He chuckled. "You're just spooked. It's the woods, man. Happens to the best of us." I nodded, trying to convince myself that he was right. It was just my imagination. After all, we had camped here many times before, and nothing had ever happened. But the uneasy feeling persisted, gnawing at the back of my mind. As the fire burned low, we both settled into our sleeping bags, the warmth of the fire now replaced by the chill of the night air. The forest was completely silent now, the kind of silence that makes you acutely aware of every small sound, the creak of the trees, the rustling of the leaves, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like you were the only living thing in the world, and yet, something about it felt wrong. I lay there staring up at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. A distant howl echoed through the night, and my heart skipped a beat. I knew it was just a coyote, but the sound sent a shiver down my spine. I closed my eyes, trying to shake off the sense of unease that had settled over me. Tomorrow would be a new day, a fresh start. We'd explore the forest, enjoy the tranquility, and maybe even do a little fishing. Everything would be fine. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something was waiting in the dark. The night passed slowly. The cold seeped into the tent despite the layers of fabric, and I spent hours tossing and turning, unable to shake the unsettling feeling that had settled deep in my chest. The forest outside was eerily quiet, save for the occasional snap of a branch or the distant call of an owl. Sam had fallen asleep almost immediately, his steady breathing a stark contrast to the nervous energy I couldn't escape. As dawn approached, the first rays of light began to filter through the trees, casting long, thin beams across the forest floor. I lay still for a while, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the subtle sounds of the woods awakening. The birds began to chirp, and the air seemed to come alive again, but the sense of unease that had gripped me the night before didn't let go. I had almost convinced myself that it was nothing more than my imagination, but a lingering doubt gnawed at the edges of my mind. I decided to get up, hoping the fresh morning air would help clear my thoughts. Quietly, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the cool morning mist wrapping around me like a shroud. The air was thick with the earthy smell of damp leaves and moss, and the forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The campfire from last night had long since burned out, and now only a faint ring of charred wood remained. I glanced around, my eyes scanning the surrounding trees. There was no sign of movement, no hint that anything was amiss, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned to look back at the tent, where Sam was still fast asleep, undisturbed. I took a deep breath and tried to push the strange sensation from my mind. It was just the wilderness playing tricks on me, I told myself. A quick walk would help settle my nerves. I decided to follow the stream that ran nearby. The water was crystal clear, and the sound of it rushing over the rocks had always been soothing. I hoped that being near the water would calm my racing thoughts. As I walked, the trees grew denser, their branches intertwining to create a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The air was cooler here, and the further I walked, the quieter it became. The birds had stopped singing, and the usual hum of insects was gone. A sudden movement in the corner of my eye made me freeze. My heart skipped a beat as I turned toward the source of the disturbance, but there was nothing there, just the wind rustling the leaves. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my nerves. I had to be imagining things, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. The unease that had started the night before had only intensified. My footsteps seemed unnaturally loud against the stillness of the forest, and the silence that surrounded me now felt suffocating. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows of the trees, but there was nothing. I kept walking, trying to ignore the growing discomfort in my chest. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. It was as if the forest itself was closing in around me, its branches reaching out like hands trying to pull me deeper into its heart. Then I saw it. A faint outline in the distance, just beyond the stream, caught my eye. It was hard to make out at first, blending in with the shadows, but as I got closer it became clearer. A figure, standing perfectly still among the trees. Iris froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was tall, its shape shrouded in the shadows, and it didn't seem to move. It was as though it was waiting for something, or someone. I strained my eyes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but before I could take another step, the figure disappeared, slipping behind the thick trunk of a nearby tree. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Was it a person? A trick of the light? Or something else? I didn't know, but the air felt thick with tension, as if the very forest was holding its breath. The sound of Sam calling my name from the campsite broke the spell. "Hey, you okay over there?" I snapped my head around, the sudden sound of my name pulling me back to reality. I didn't know what I had just seen, but the sight of Sam's familiar face at the edge of the clearing was a relief. I turned quickly and jogged back to the camp, trying to shake the strange feeling that had gripped me. When I returned, Sam was sitting by the fire, sipping coffee from a thermos. "Everything all right?" he asked, looking up at me with a raised eyebrow. I replied, forcing a smile. "Just needed a walk." "You sure? You look a little off," he said, his tone laced with concern. I didn't know how to explain what I had seen, or thought I had seen. I didn't want to sound crazy. "I'm fine, just a little jumpy. I think I'm still waking up." Sam didn't press the issue, and we fell into a comfortable silence as we sat by the fire. But the feeling of unease remained, lingering in the back of my mind. The forest felt different now, darker somehow, even though the sun was higher in the sky. As the morning wore on, I tried to push the unsettling thoughts away, focusing on the mundane tasks of setting up for the day. We planned to hike further into the woods, maybe find a good spot for fishing or explore a bit more. I tried to convince myself that whatever I had seen was just a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the growing sense that something wasn't right. And then, just as I was about to turn away from the campfire, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. A faint rustle like footsteps coming from the trees just beyond the clearing. My blood ran cold, and I froze, listening intently. Sam didn't seem to notice, but I could hear it clearly now. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was moving closer. I didn't move. I couldn't. The footsteps were getting closer, but there was no one in sight. My mind raced as I scanned the edge of the forest, trying to make sense of what was happening. The sound was unmistakable. A soft crunch of dry leaves and twigs underfoot. The slow, deliberate pace of someone, or something, walking just out of view. I turned to Sam, but he was still sitting by the fire, unaware of the growing tension in the air. He was focused on the coffee cup in his hand, his attention elsewhere. "Sam..." My voice came out as a whisper. almost too quiet to be heard. I cleared my throat and tried again, this time louder. "Sam, do you hear that?" He looked up, his brow furrowing in confusion. Hear what? The footsteps. They were still there, unmistakable now. I couldn't understand how Sam couldn't hear them. They were so close, just beyond the trees, moving toward us with purpose. I was sure of it. I stood up abruptly, my legs trembling slightly beneath me. "Listen," I said, more urgently this time. Sam's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing as he strained to listen. He cocked his head, but the footsteps had stopped. Just like that. The air was still, eerily so. The forest, which had once seemed alive with the sound of birds and insects, had fallen into a suffocating silence. No," Sam said after a long pause. "I don't hear anything." I felt a chill run down my spine, and my heart started to pound. I wasn't imagining this. The footsteps were real, and they had been moving closer, closer to the camp. But now the forest was dead silent again. I looked around, my eyes scanning the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. "Maybe it was an animal," Sam suggested, trying to offer an explanation. "Could have been a deer or something." I nodded, though I wasn't convinced. It didn't sound like an animal. It didn't feel like one either. It felt deliberate, like someone was watching us, moving closer with intention. I wanted to believe Sam, I really did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in the woods. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end. I glanced over my shoulder again, but still, there was nothing. I sat back down by the fire, but my eyes never left the trees. I was aware of every movement, every sound in the distance. The silence was almost deafening, pressing in on me. My mind was racing, replaying the sound of those footsteps over and over, trying to make sense of it. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. I didn't want to be out here anymore. "Maybe we should pack up and head back," I said, my voice tight. "It's just, I don't know, something doesn't feel right." Sam raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "You're not seriously freaked out by a few footsteps, are you? It's just the woods. It gets quiet out here sometimes." I could tell he was trying to reassure me, but the unease was still crawling under my skin, making me itch with discomfort. It was more than just the footsteps. It was the sense of being watched, of something unseen lurking just out of reach. "I know," I replied, forcing a laugh to cover the tension in my voice. I don't know. Maybe I'm just being paranoid." Sam gave me a half smile and patted my shoulder. "It's all right. Let's take a walk later. Clear our heads. You'll feel better." I nodded, though the tight knot in my stomach didn't loosen. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just beyond the reach of the firelight, something that knew we were here. The day passed in a blur of quiet conversations and nervous laughter, but the tension never fully lifted. Every time I glanced at the trees, I half expected to see someone or something standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us. But nothing ever appeared. The footsteps never returned. By the time the sun began to set, the sky painted in hues of pink and orange, I was already regretting our decision to stay another night. My mind kept drifting back to the forest, to the shadows that seemed to move on their own. Sam, however, was in good spirits. He seemed unaffected by the odd sense of foreboding that had settled over me. As darkness fell, the forest transformed. The sounds of the day disappeared, replaced by the low whispers of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. It felt as though the forest was alive in a way I couldn't understand. Watching, waiting. We ate our dinner by the fire, but I barely tasted the food. My mind was elsewhere, replaying every sound, every moment from the day. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Clay, when we finished eating, Sam stood up and stretched. "All right, let's go for that walk," he said with a grin. "You'll feel better once we get some fresh air." Hesitated, my eyes flicking nervously toward the woods. I wanted to go, to get out of the camp, but part of me was terrified of what might be waiting out there. "I don't know," I began, but Sam was already moving toward the trail. "You'll be fine," he said, glancing back over his shoulder. "It's just a walk." Reluctantly, I followed him, my feet heavy with each step. The firelight faded behind us, and soon we were enveloped by the darkness of the forest. The path was narrow, winding through thick trees that seemed to close in around us with every step. When we'd stepped across the line into the larger trees, Nathaniel's fist collapsed with such force that it nearly drove him mad. As we walked, the silence felt oppressive. My every movement seemed too loud, too conspicuous. The forest felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Standing tall, I studied the landscape, trying to find tiny markers. And then I heard it again. A soft rustling, like footsteps, just beyond the trees. The moment I heard the footsteps again, a wave of cold terror washed over me. It wasn't just the sound itself. It was the rhythm, the pacing, and the unmistakable feeling that someone or something was following us. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. My breath hitched as I glanced at Sam, but he was walking ahead, completely unaware of the growing unease that was choking me. "Sam," I whispered, barely able to force the words out. My voice trembled, despite my efforts to remain calm. "Do you hear that?" Sam turned around, his brow furrowing. "Hear what?" I strained to listen, my pulse thundering in my ears. The footsteps were still there, echoing from somewhere deeper in the forest, just beyond our line of sight. But it wasn't the same as before. This time, there was a subtle shift in the air, like the trees themselves were listening, waiting. "I think we should go back," I said, my voice shaky. "There's something out there. I don't feel right about this." Sam sighed, his face lighting up with a faint smile. "Come on, you're just hearing things. It's probably just an animal or the wind. We're in the woods, remember?" But as he spoke, something changed in the atmosphere. The wind, which had been gentle moments before, now picked up in sudden, sharp gusts. The trees creaked and groaned, their branches swaying as though responding to an unseen force. It was as if the entire forest was alive, reacting to the sound of our voices, slowly and determinedly. And then the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was so heavy, so absolute, that it felt suffocating. I looked around, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. My gaze flicked nervously from tree to tree, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. But no matter how hard I tried to calm myself, the oppressive weight of the silence felt like a warning. Something was out there, and it was watching us. My opponent had seen. Sam must have noticed the shift in my demeanor, because he turned to face me, his expression now more serious. "All right, maybe we should head back to camp," he said, though his tone was still calm. He started walking toward the path, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. As we made our way back to the camp, the forest seemed to close in on us. The path, once clear and wide, now felt narrow and claustrophobic. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of panic through me. It was as though something was moving just out of view, following our every step. I could feel the weight of the trees pressing in around us, their twisted branches casting long, dark shadows across the trail. And then, just as we reached the edge of the clearing, it happened. A whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it was unmistakable. The sound of a voice, soft and breathless, carried on the wind. It wasn't in a language I could understand, but it was a voice nonetheless. A voice that sent shivers crawling down my spine. "Neri," Stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding so loudly that it drowned out the sound of the whisper. Sam, who was several paces ahead of me, turned around, his eyes narrowing. "What's wrong?" I couldn't answer. My throat had gone dry, and my mouth felt like it was full of cotton. The whisper came again, this time clearer, but still unintelligible. It was like the trees themselves were speaking, their voices woven into the wind. I took a step backward, my legs trembling beneath me. "Did you hear that?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. Sam's eyes darted nervously around the darkened forest. "Hear what?" The whispering grew louder, and I could feel it vibrating in my chest now, like the very air was humming with an unseen presence. I could almost make out words, but they were just out of reach, slipping through my mind like water through my fingers. A little sooner than expected. "Let's go," I said, grabbing Sam's arm. My grip was tight, my fingers digging into his sleeve. "Now." "Sam." Sam didn't hesitate. He could see the panic in my eyes, and that was enough. Without a word, we turned and hurried back to the camp, our footsteps quick and heavy against the forest floor. The whispering faded as we walked, but the air still felt thick with something unseen. The trees seemed to watch us as we passed, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands as though trying to keep us from leaving. But he saw the result. Sam gave the whispering occasional thought like gnarled hands as though trying to keep us from leaving. When we finally reached the camp, I collapsed onto the ground, my heart racing. Sam stood over me, his expression serious. He didn't speak at first, but I could see the doubt in his eyes, the uncertainty. He hadn't heard the whispering, but something in the air had shifted, and I could feel it in the way he looked at me. We sat in silence for a long while, the crackling fire our only source of comfort in the darkened night. The forest around us was alive with the sounds of insects and distant animals, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the trees. Every shadow seemed to move, every gust of wind seemed to carry a warning. The whispering was still in my mind, a constant, nagging presence. I couldn't forget the way the voice had sounded, soft, almost pleading, but laced with an unmistakable sense of malice. Something in the forest was trying to reach us, trying to draw us in. And then, just as I was beginning to calm down, something caught my eye. A figure standing at the edge of the camp. It was tall, dark, and featureless, just a silhouette against the trees. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but when I looked again, it was gone. "Hi." I shook my head, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Did you see that?" Sam turned around, his face paling when he saw the empty space where I had pointed. "Seaboyd." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was spinning, my thoughts racing in 100 directions. The figure had been there, right there, standing in the darkness. But now it was gone, and I wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that I had seen it, or the fact that Sam hadn't. The fire crackled softly in the middle of the campsite, its warm glow a stark contrast to the eerie cold that seemed to be creeping from the forest's edge. Sam and I sat in silence, the weight of what I had seen, or thought I had seen, hanging heavily between us. He hadn't noticed the figure, but the look on his face told me that he could feel the tension, the same unease gnawing at him that I felt deep in my bones. "Maybe we should head back to the cabin," I said, my voice low and trembling. "Something's wrong out here, Sam. I can feel it." "Thing right?" Sam hesitated, glancing over at me. "Look, we've been out here for hours. Maybe you're just tired. The forest messes with your mind sometimes, you know? We'll pack up in the morning, all right?" I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think that I was just imagining things, that the exhaustion and isolation had finally gotten to me. but something deep inside me knew that this wasn't just my mind playing tricks. The air felt different. The forest felt alive, and not in a good way. Yeah, I muttered, but the word felt hollow. I guess. The wind shifted, carrying a strange, unfamiliar scent. Something musty, almost rotten, like decaying leaves mixed with something more pungent. It curled around me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I shifted uncomfortably, my eyes darting nervously toward the dark line of trees just beyond the firelight. The whispers, too, had not fully stopped. They lingered in the air, faint but persistent, as though they were just outside the range of hearing, teasing me with their unintelligible murmurings. They weren't coming from any particular direction. No, it was as though they were coming from everywhere at once, circling us, watching us. Suddenly, the fire flickered. Just for a moment, the flames danced wildly before settling again, casting long, distorted shadows across the campsite. I glanced up at Sam, who seemed to be staring into the dark woods with furrowed brows. I followed his gaze, but all I saw was the endless line of trees, their dark branches stretching out like skeletal fingers reaching for us. "Did you see that?" Sam whispered. I swallowed hard, nodding slowly. Yeah, something's out there. The hairs on my arms prickled as I listened, trying to focus on the sound of the wind, but there was something else. A low, guttural growl, deep and primal, echoed through the trees. It was a sound unlike anything I had ever heard before, and it froze me to the core. My blood ran cold, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Sam looked at me, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I stammered. "That didn't sound like an animal." Sam stood up quickly, his hand moving to the handle of the axe we'd brought with us for firewood. "Stay here, I'll go check it out." "Are you insane?" I grabbed his arm, my grip tight. "Don't go out there. We need to leave, Sam. Now." But Sam shook me off, his jaw clenched in determination. "I'm not going to sit here and wait for something to happen. I'll be back in a minute." Before I could stop him, he disappeared into the dark woods, the faint crunch of his footsteps barely audible over the increasing wind. I was left alone, sitting by the fire, my heart racing in my chest. The whispering seemed to grow louder, more urgent now, as if it was reaching out to me. My eyes darted from the trees to the shadows, every rustle in the leaves making my pulse spike. I waited and waited. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, and yet no time passed at all. It was as though the world around me had frozen, each second drawing out in a terrifying slow motion. My mind kept replaying the growl I had heard earlier, over and over, as though it was burned into my memory. The longer I waited, the more I felt like something was drawing closer, something unseen, just beyond my vision. Then I heard something. A twig snapped, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing, like someone or something was standing just out of sight, watching me. I turned my head sharply, eyes wide, but I saw nothing, only the forest. Only the dark, twisted shapes of the trees swaying gently in the wind. My heartbeat was so loud in my ears it was all I could hear. And right now, "Sam?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to admit how scared I was, but it was there, suffocating me. The silence that followed made it feel like the forest was holding its breath. Waiting. A shadow flickered at the edge of the trees. I jumped, my breath catching in my throat. My pulse spiked, and I jumped to my feet, grabbing the nearest object I could find, a small jagged rock from the ground, and clutching it in my shaking hand. I squinted into the dark, trying to make out any movement, any sign of Sam. "Sam!" I called out again, louder this time, my voice shaking with panic. "Answer me." A rustle came from the woods, followed by a low, familiar growl. The same growl, but this time it was much closer. It had to be the same growl. My heart skipped a beat, and the world around me seemed to tilt. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. I could feel it in my very bones. And then the figure appeared again. It was no longer just a silhouette, but a shape. A tall, dark figure, standing just outside the fire's reach. Its outline blurry and indistinct. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence. Cold, oppressive, and full of something dark. My breath caught in my throat, my hands trembling so badly that I almost dropped the rock. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my chest. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, and I felt my legs weaken, like they were no longer my own. The whispers came again, louder this time, the voices overlapping, and I could almost hear words now, words that made no sense but filled me with dread. And then, from behind the figure, I saw something else. Sam's flashlight beam, swinging wildly, cutting through the darkness. "Sam!" I screamed, desperate. The figure turned, as if sensing the light, and in that moment I saw it, just for a brief, horrifying second. The figure's face. It was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. Its lips were twisted into a grotesque smile, its teeth sharp and jagged. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, swallowed by the forest. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched the beam of Sam's flashlight slice through the trees. The figure was gone, vanished into the darkness like smoke. But the image of its face, the hollow eyes, the twisted smile, was burned into my mind. I felt as if I could still feel its gaze on me, pressing into my skin, making every inch of me tremble. "Sam!" I shouted again, my voice now desperate, cracking with fear. "Where are you?" The beam of light moved closer, but Sam was not in sight. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. My throat tightened, and I felt a wave of nausea hit me. Every part of me screamed to run, to get out of this place, but my feet felt glued to the ground, my legs shaking too violently to move. Then, finally I heard him, his voice faint and strained, calling from somewhere deep in the woods. "I'm here, I'm fine, just stay where you are." I breathed a sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. There was something off about his tone, something that made my blood run cold. Sam was never this calm when things got tense, and there was an edge to his voice, something that sent a shiver down my spine. "Sam," I called back, trying to steady my voice. "Come back, please. Something's wrong. I saw—" But the words died on my lips as I heard a loud rustling from the trees. My body went rigid, and I instinctively took a step back, my eyes scanning the shadows. Was it the same figure, or something worse? The flashlight beam flickered, and then I saw Sam. But he wasn't alone. A figure stood beside him, a shadowy silhouette that blended seamlessly into the darkness. I couldn't make out any details at first, but I could see that it was tall, taller than Sam even. It stood motionless, its head tilted slightly as if it was studying him, and then, just like before, the eerie whispers started, low and faint at first, but growing louder with every passing second. "Sam!" I screamed again, but this time my voice was laced with panic. "Get away from it! Sam, run!" Sam didn't respond. He just stood there, his body stiff, as though he couldn't hear me, or didn't want to. The figure beside him didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on the air. It was as though the forest itself had come alive, breathing with an ancient, malevolent force. The lightning flashed across my body, and my chest rose and fell. I took a step forward, my heart racing, and the whispers grew louder, more urgent. They were everywhere, surrounding me, suffocating me. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone. There was something in the tone that sent chills up my spine. It was mocking, as if whatever was out there knew exactly how terrified I was. It slipped into my mind as if it was agreeing with me, but without my having the frame of mind to comprehend it. The flashlight flickered again, casting brief, frantic bursts of light across the scene, and in that split second, I saw it. The figure was gone. Sam was alone. I froze, unable to move, my breath caught in my throat. "Sam," I whispered, my voice barely audible. There was no response. Nothing. The silence was deafening. And then, slowly, Sam began to walk back toward me. His movements were stiff, jerky, like he wasn't fully in control of his body. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge me as he passed by, his eyes staring blankly ahead. His flashlight bounced with each step, illuminating the forest floor in sharp, erratic flashes. My stomach churned as I watched him, something deep within me telling me that this wasn't Sam anymore. This was something else, something wearing his skin, mimicking his movements but not him. "Sam?" I called out again, more firmly this time, but my voice trembled. "What happened? Where did you go?" He didn't respond. He didn't even seem to hear me. My fear spiked. I felt the air around me grow colder, the oppressive weight of the forest pressing in on me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see that same figure lurking just out of sight, but the forest was still. Silent. Too silent. I reached out, my hand shaking, and touched Sam's shoulder. He froze. For a moment I thought I saw his eyes flicker, just a brief flash of recognition, but it was gone before I could make sense of it. He turned his head slowly, his gaze locking with mine. And that's when I saw it. XO! His eyes weren't Sam's eyes. They were hollow, dark, empty. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. "Sam? What's happening?" But it wasn't Sam who answered. The figure that had been standing beside him in the woods, the one that had disappeared in the blink of an eye, now stood behind him. And it wasn't just standing. It was watching me. The same hollow, gaunt face I had seen earlier, those eyes, wide and empty, locked onto mine. The figure's lips twisted into a grin that was far too wide, stretching unnaturally, almost painfully across its face. Old Sam, or whatever it was, took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it were trying to imitate something human, but failing miserably. The whispers came again, louder now, echoing all around us. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The firelight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to dance and writhe like living things. I couldn't take my eyes off of Sam, or whatever had replaced him. I had to get out of there, now. "Sam," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Please, please snap out of it. We need to leave. We need to go back to the cabin." But Sam didn't respond. The figure, whatever it was, took another step toward me. And that was when I realized it wasn't just standing there anymore. It was coming closer. I turned and ran. My breath was ragged as I dashed through the dark forest, my mind racing with fear. Behind me I could hear the faint shuffle of footsteps, too slow, too deliberate. It wasn't Sam. It couldn't be. It was that thing. The shadow. The twisted figure that had been haunting us from the moment we set foot in these woods. The trees blurred around me, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, scratching at my face as I ran. My feet stumbled over rocks and uneven ground, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The forest felt endless, like it was stretching on forever, keeping me trapped inside its claustrophobic grip. I glanced over my shoulder, heart pounding, and saw nothing. just the oppressive darkness of the trees. But I knew it was there, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows, its presence lingering like a cold breath on the back of my neck. The whispers were back, faint at first, then growing louder and more insistent. They seemed to come from all around me, from the trees, from the wind itself. The air was thick with them, suffocating, buzzing in my ears. I could barely hear my own thoughts. "Sam!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Sam, where are you?" There was no answer, no reply, just the whispers and the darkness pressing in on me, suffocating every breath. The further I ran, the less I felt in control. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, uneven, as though the forest itself was moving. Every time I looked behind me, the shadows seemed to stretch closer, as if they were gaining on me. I needed to get back to the cabin. That was the only place I could think of. If I could just get there, I could lock myself in, shut the world out. Maybe I could wait it out, wait for daylight, for some sign that this nightmare would end. But the deeper I ran into the woods, the further from the cabin I seemed to get. And that's when I realized the trees were changing. They weren't the same ones I had passed before. The bark was darker, the branches twisted in unnatural shapes. I felt like I was running in circles. But the forest refused to give up its secrets. The path, if it had ever existed, was gone. The whispers grew louder, sharper now, like voices pressing into my mind, telling me things I couldn't understand. My pulse quickened, and I stumbled, tripping over a root that had appeared out of nowhere. My hands hit the ground hard, and for a moment, I thought I had broken something. But I didn't care. I had to get up. I had to keep moving. With a sharp intake of breath, I forced myself to my feet, my eyes scanning the darkness around me, searching for something, anything familiar. But there was nothing. Only the oppressive shadows, the twisted trees, and that sense of being hunted. This aroused the half-abbreviated Carlyle. And then there was a sound, a soft, almost inaudible sound, but it froze me in my tracks. My parents. A twig snapping, the unmistakable sound of someone, something, moving through the forest. I turned, heart leaping into my throat, and saw it. In the distance, standing at the edge of the clearing, was the figure. It was still motionless, as if it were waiting for me to see it. The darkness clung to it, the shape barely visible, but there was no mistaking its presence. The same hollow eyes, the same twisted grin. I could feel it staring at me, watching, waiting. I had no doubt it knew exactly where I was, even if I couldn't see it clearly. Panic surged through me, and I started running again, this time without a single thought. My limbs burned from the effort, my chest tight with the weight of fear. I could hear the footsteps now, slow, deliberate, never far behind. It was toying with me, playing with me. A hunt. I was the prey, and it was closing in. I didn't dare look behind me again. I couldn't afford to. But then I heard it. A voice. A whisper. Turn around. It wasn't Sam's voice. It wasn't human at all. It came from everywhere surrounding me, 1,000 voices woven into one, all urging me to look back, to see what was there. But my heart raced. Every instinct told me not to listen. Every fiber of my being screamed to keep running, to never stop. But the voice was so compelling, so familiar, that I couldn't resist. I slowed my pace and turned. Nothing. The forest was still, silent, as if mocking my fear. I took a few more steps forward, my heart still hammering in my chest. The whispers faded, and for a brief moment I thought maybe I had escaped it. But the figure appeared again, standing in the shadows just ahead of me. Only this time, it wasn't alone. They were more. 3, no, 4 figures, their twisted shapes barely discernible in the darkness, their eyes glowing faintly, their grins wide and unnatural. They moved slowly, shifting in and out of the shadows surrounding me. I was trapped. Suddenly, everything went quiet. The whispers, the footsteps, everything ceased, leaving only the sound of my own breath, ragged and uneven as I stood frozen in place. The figures closed in, their presence overwhelming. One of them stepped forward, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. "Leave," it whispered, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "Now, before it's too late." I didn't move. I couldn't. The figure reached out, and for a split second I thought I saw Sam's face behind the shadows, his eyes wide, terrified, as if begging me to leave, to escape while I still could. But it was too late. I turned and ran faster than I'd ever run before, through the trees, past the figures, ignoring the pain in my legs and the terror clawing at my throat. I had no idea where I was going, but I couldn't stop. Not now, not ever. My lungs burned as I stumbled through the dark, every step heavier than the last. My feet hit the ground like thunder, crashing through the brush, but my mind was a blur, consumed by one thought: escape. I couldn't think of anything else. I didn't dare look back, though every nerve in my body screamed at me to. The shadows in the trees felt alive, shifting with every movement, whispering my name like an incantation. They wanted me. They were calling me, drawing me in, and I couldn't understand why. Why me? Why now? The questions blurred with the pounding of my heart. I didn't know how much time had passed. Hours, minutes, seconds. It all felt the same. The forest stretched on forever, its endless trees closing in, trapping me in a labyrinth of fear. The air was thick, too thick, with something unnatural. It pressed against me, suffocating me, and I couldn't breathe. I could feel it, the weight of something watching me from all directions, but I dared not turn, not again. Then, a sound, so quiet at first I almost thought it was in my head. A voice, soft, faint, like a whisper carried by the wind. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. It was my name, Emily. The voice wasn't Sam's. It was colder, distant, hollow, the kind of voice that crawls into your mind and fills it with dread. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise, my body frozen in place, as if the forest itself had become a part of me, binding me to its will. I turned, but there was nothing. Just the darkness, just the trees, the twisted trunks reaching toward the sky like hands. "Emily?" The voice came again, this time closer. It was so close, too close. I whirled around, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what was behind me, but I had no choice. I had to know. And when I did turn, my eyes locked onto the figure. It was there, standing just beyond the reach of the trees. But this time, it wasn't just one shadow. There were more. Shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, swirling and twisting like smoke. The air around them was thick with an oppressive chill, and I could see their eyes now, glowing faintly, like the embers of a dying fire. They were watching me. I could feel it, their gaze burning through me. I could hear their whispers now, 1,000 voices overlapping, blending into one. They were speaking to each other, but I couldn't make out the words. I didn't need to. I could feel their intent. They were speaking of me. I wanted to run. I needed to run, but my legs were frozen, locked in place as if the earth itself was holding me captive. The shadows began to move, stepping forward, and I could see the twisted shapes of their bodies now. Human, but wrong. Distorted, their limbs bent in unnatural angles, their faces stretched in grotesque smiles that never seemed to end. "Emily?" The voice came again, this time from directly behind me. It wasn't one of the shadows. It was a familiar voice. I spun around. There, standing in the darkness, was Sam. But it wasn't Sam. It couldn't be. His eyes were wide, his face pale and drawn, his mouth hanging open as if in shock. His body seemed wrong. There was something off about the way he stood, something unnatural about the way his head tilted to one side, like he was listening for something. I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I took a step forward, my feet moving against my will, as if I was drawn to him. I wanted to believe it was him. I wanted to believe he was alive, that he had somehow found me. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't Sam. It was something else, something that wore his face like a mask, finally. And as I took another step, I saw it. Behind Sam, standing in the shadows, was the thing. The one I had seen before, the twisted figure that had haunted me from the start. It stood still and motionless, watching me with its hollow eyes. And it wasn't alone. More figures appeared, one after another, each one darker than the last, each one twisted beyond recognition. The shadows closed in, and I knew then that there was no escape. Exercising. But then, something strange happened. A sound like a crackling fire filled the air, a deep, unsettling rumble, as if the earth itself was shifting beneath my feet. The figures faltered, their movements growing erratic. I could hear them, their whispers faltering, as if something was disrupting their hold on the forest. Their compression made the scattering harder to discern. And then the ground trembled. The trees around me began to groan and crack, their roots pulling free from the earth. A sudden burst of light pierced the darkness, bright, blinding, like the sun breaking through a storm cloud. I shielded my eyes, unable to see, and when the light faded, the figures were gone. The forest was still. For a moment I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. Had I imagined it all? Was I losing my mind? But as I looked around, the air felt different, lighter, less oppressive. I took a tentative step forward, my legs still trembling from the adrenaline. The forest was eerily quiet now. The oppressive weight of the shadows lifted. And that's when I saw it. The cabin. I hadn't realized how close I had come, but there it was, standing at the edge of the forest, its silhouette framed by the fading light of dusk. I could see the familiar shape of the porch, the flickering light through the window. I didn't hesitate. I ran toward it, not looking back, my breath ragged in my chest, my heart still pounding in my ears. The door creaked open as I approached, and I stepped inside, slamming it shut behind me. The silence in the cabin was deafening. I leaned against the door, my heart still racing, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. What had just happened? What was that thing in the forest? What were those figures? And most of all, where was Sam? I glanced around the cabin, my eyes darting from corner to corner, half expecting to see something move in the shadows. But there was nothing, just silence, and the lingering sense that something was still out there, waiting. I stood in the center of the cabin, my pulse hammering in my chest. The door was locked behind me, the only sound the soft creaking of the wood settling under the weight of the night. The silence in the cabin was suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I had to get my bearings. I had to think. The darkness outside had swallowed the forest whole, and I needed to make sense of what had happened. I could still hear the echoes of those whispers in my mind, the chilling voices calling my name. But no, I couldn't let myself get lost in that fear. I had to find Sam. I glanced toward the small table in the corner of the room where the flashlight I'd dropped earlier still lay. I moved toward it, my feet dragging, as if the weight of the air itself was pulling me down. I picked it up, turned it on, and a soft beam of light cut through the darkness. My eyes scanned the room. Nothing. Nothing but the worn wooden floorboards and the cracked windows letting in the faintest traces of moonlight. The room was almost exactly how I remembered it from the night before, but there was something off. Something wasn't right. I turned to the small kitchen area, the smell of stale air lingering in the space. The countertops were bare, but the sink... I froze. The sink was filled with water. Not just any water. The surface of the water was slick with something dark, something that shimmered in the flashlight's glow. My stomach twisted, the air thickening with the taste of metal. Blood. I backed away from the sink, my pulse racing again, my breath quickening. This wasn't right. It couldn't be. I had to find Sam. I had to get out of here. But then I saw it. The door to the small bedroom at the back of the cabin was ajar, just a crack, the faintest sliver of blackness behind it. My heart skipped a beat. Had I left it like that, or had something opened it while I wasn't looking? All right. I slowly approached, each step feeling heavier than the last. The beam of the flashlight trembled in my hand as I reached the door. My mind raced, wondering if I was about to find something I wasn't ready for. I pushed the door open with a creak that seemed to echo through the entire cabin. And there, in the corner of the room, was Sam. At first I thought it was him standing motionless, his back turned to me. But then I noticed something wasn't right. His body was unnaturally still, and there was something strange about the way his limbs were positioned. Finally, I took the first step to the sitting room for a better view of the conversation. As I approached the door, I saw the bed was unmistakably male. At first, I thought it was him, standing motionless, his back turned to me, but then I noticed something wasn't right. His body was unnaturally still, and the wheelchair was unmotionless. I stepped closer, my breath caught in my throat. Sam didn't move. He didn't acknowledge me. "Sam?" I whispered, my voice trembling. No response. I moved even closer, the hairs on my neck prickling as I took in the sight of him. His clothes were torn, his face pale, but it wasn't the physical state that sent shivers down my spine. It was the way his head hung at a natural angle, the way his eyes were wide open, staring into nothingness. I reached out, trembling, and touched his shoulder. The second my fingers made contact, a coldness shot through me. His skin was icy to the touch, unnaturally cold. My heart stopped. This wasn't Sam. This was something else. Sam. Suddenly I heard a low groan, a sound that rumbled deep within Sam's chest, like something trying to claw its way out. I said. I recoiled in horror, stumbling backward. His eyes snapped to mine, locking onto me with an intensity that sent a surge of fear through my veins. "Emily," he whispered, his voice low, but it wasn't his voice. It was hollow, like a whisper from a distant grave. "You shouldn't have come." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. The figure before me was wearing Sam's face, but I knew it wasn't him. It couldn't be. The room grew colder. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, reaching toward me with fingers made of darkness. And then the whispers began again, louder this time, filling the room with an overwhelming pressure. "Get out." The voice was now everywhere, all around me, inside my head, inside my soul. It was the voice of the forest, the voice of the thing that had been calling me, watching me, the voice that had been tormenting me from the moment I stepped foot in this place. The dogs started barking and raising their voices as they were used to around me. "Emily." I backed away, my legs trembling beneath me. but I couldn't take my eyes off Sam's body. The figure before me was smiling now, a wide, twisted grin that stretched unnaturally across its face. Its teeth were sharp, too sharp, like those of a predator, and the eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light. I had to get out, but the door slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled the entire cabin. I turned around, panicked, and tried to pry it open, but it wouldn't budge. The room was closing in. The walls felt like they were pressing against me, the air thick and suffocating. I could hear the thing moving behind me, its footsteps echoing in the dark. I could feel it, the pressure building. It wanted me. And then I heard it. A voice. Not the hollow one, not the thing in front of me, but the real Sam's voice. It was faint, like a distant whisper, but it was there. Emily. Dawes. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. There, standing by the window, was Sam. Not the twisted version, the real Sam. His eyes were wide with fear, his body trembling, as if he had been trying to get to me for ages. "Sam!" I cried, my voice breaking. "Emily?" His voice was strained, desperate. "You need to leave. You need to leave now." I ran toward him, but as I reached for his hand, he disappeared, fading into the darkness. The last thing I saw were his eyes, pleading, terrified, before they vanished completely. The room was empty again. The whispers began anew, this time louder, more insistent. And I realized with a sickening certainty that I was alone. The whispers were relentless now, clawing at my mind, filling every inch of the cabin with their cold, mocking tone. I could feel them closing in on me, as if the very walls were alive, shifting and pressing down on me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned in circles, trying to find the exit, but everything felt like it was closing in. There was no escape. Whoa. I was trapped. The darkness in the room seemed to pulse, alive and aware. It reached for me, wrapping its tendrils around my body, tugging me toward the center of the room. The air was thick, suffocating, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. My eyes were wide, my mind racing. I needed to think. I needed to... Suddenly, a sound broke through the chaos. A sharp, jarring noise that sliced through the whispers like a knife. It was the sound of a door creaking open. I froze. Could it be? Could it be the door to the outside? I whipped my head toward the sound, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but I could have sworn I saw a faint sliver of light spill into the room. A way out. The door. I rushed toward it, stumbling over the floorboards in my haste. My legs were shaky, my mind foggy with fear, but I couldn't stop now. I had to escape. I had to leave this place behind. I had to... A hand grabbed my wrist. I spun around, my pulse leaping in my throat, and there it was. The thing, the creature, the force that had haunted me since I first set foot in this cursed forest. Its form was shifting, a shadowy figure that seemed to flicker in and out of existence, its face nothing more than a dark blur of eyes and teeth. The grip on my wrist was ice cold, sending a shock through my body, and I could feel the strength of it, a grip that was far stronger than anything a human could possess. "No!" I screamed, trying to pull away, but the thing didn't let go. It twisted my arm painfully, forcing me to face it. It spat. "Where do you think you're going?" Its voice was low, a distorted echo of something ancient and malevolent. It sounded like the forest itself was speaking, the earth beneath me groaning with its words. I couldn't move. The fear paralyzed me, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. I wanted to fight, but I knew deep down that I was powerless. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, my voice strangled by the terror that clawed at me from the inside. And then, in that moment of stillness, I heard something else. A whisper. A voice I recognized. Emily, it's not too late. It was Sam's voice, faint, distant, but unmistakable. I didn't know where it was coming from. Was it real? Was I imagining it? The whispers of the forest were so overwhelming that I could barely tell anymore. But the voice, Sam's voice, seemed to carry a thread of hope, a glimmer of light in the darkness. Hush, The thing in front of me snarled, its face contorting into a grotesque smile. You can't escape. You belong to us now. The air grew heavier, thick with the weight of its words. The creature's grip tightened, and I felt the pressure on my wrist like a vice. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything, but I was frozen, paralyzed by the suffocating terror that consumed me. And then, something shifted. The faint light from the door grew brighter. I blinked, my eyes refocusing on the sliver of light that now seemed to stretch wider, almost inviting. Emily? Sam's voice was clearer now, louder, as if it was coming from right behind me. I turned my head, my heart pounding with disbelief. There, standing at the threshold of the open door, was Sam. For a moment I didn't know if it was real, if it was just another trick of the darkness, but his eyes, they were the same eyes, filled with warmth and fear, and I could see his hand reaching toward me. Silently, he said, in the same slow, careful voice. "Come with me," he whispered, his voice full of urgency. "Hurry!" The creature snarled again, its grip still firm on my wrist, but my mind was racing. I had a choice now. I could either stay trapped in this nightmare, or I could reach for Sam, take his hand, and escape. The thing in front of me roared in fury, its shadowy form twisting in the air, but I didn't hesitate. I couldn't. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pulled away from the creature's grip. It howled in rage, but it couldn't hold me. The darkness tried to pull me back, tried to swallow me whole, but I ignored it. I ran toward the light. Sam's hand was waiting for me, his fingers brushing mine, pulling me into the safety of the open door. And just like that, the darkness lifted. The whispers stopped. The cold, suffocating air disappeared, and I was bathed in the warm glow of the moonlight. The response from the battleships began. I stood in the doorway, gasping for breath, staring at Sam as he looked at me with wide, relieved eyes. We made it," he whispered. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe him. But as I glanced back at the cabin, at the forest beyond, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The darkness still lingered, just beyond the trees, like a shadow waiting for its next victim. We were free. For now. But deep down, I knew the forest wasn't finished with us. Not yet. And it would never truly let go. In the story,